Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this session on risk. We have a fantastic panel. I'm excited to hear what they have to say. And we're going to try and cover the globe in 55 minutes. And we have Shaukat Aziz on my right, who is the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, General Wesley Clark, former NATO general and presidential candidate, Tina Fordham, a political analyst at Citigroup, Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, so just be very careful what you said, and Professor Ron Waldman of the George Washington University. And we're going to cover a wide range of risks. And we're going to start off, I think, by considering whether the world really is a riskier place. I grew up with presidential assassinations, the threat of nuclear war, the IRA, the Red Brigade, and also 2 potential prime ministerial assassinations in my lifetime. So it's easy to get carried away by newspaper headlines. But are we really in a riskier place now than we were when the panelists started their adult lives? So I'm going to ask General Clark for your view. Well,
I wouldn't say we were riskier than we were at the height of the crises of the Cold War, but we've become used to, since 1991-92, the world has appeared stable, and it appeared to be moving in a certain direction. And as Gabriel Garcia Marquez said to me at one point in 1996, he said, "It's so boring now. There's only one ideology, and it's your ideology." And it's no longer boring. The world is changing. It's clear that there are different models of political organization, and there are forces that are likely to reshape the structures that we've become used to. So there's an enormous struggle going on in Eastern Europe now. And of course, the United States is fixated on ISIS, but there's a political agenda, there's a Saudi agenda in that, and then there's China. And so there are big changes afoot. The pot's heating up, the bubbles are starting to go, and the frog is still swimming happily in the heating pot. That's the way I see it.
And Mr. Aziz, time was when everybody could tour Pakistan to play cricket, and now Pakistan plays its games in the Middle East of cricket. So is that prima facie evidence that Pakistan, at least, is a lot riskier place?
Well, Pakistan has some unique risks because of the region it is in, because of what's happening in the world. If I can just step back a little from Pakistan and say globally, we are in a riskier environment today. And I think we are not always correct in identifying the root causes. We look at the effects of extremism and a riskier environment, but the root causes, in my view, would be a weakening leadership in the world, lack of cohesion between the big powers, the P5 for lack of another word, the permanent members of the Security Council, and a feeling of deprivation. Terrorism or extremism, one risk which we face, there are many others, is not a risk which, to me, represents just a policing or intelligence type of activity. The root causes are not looked at by many of the countries and the stakeholders. So if people have empty stomachs, no jobs, a lack of reason to live, then they move towards an extreme behavior. And that can manifest itself in many forms. That is really the root cause. But we go after the symptoms, catch this, catch that, which is also part of it. But unless we hit at the root causes, unless we identify them, each environment is different, each country is different, each region is different, we will always be lacking in our solution to the problems. The one reason for terrorist activity today is deprivation. Deprivation manifests itself in many forms: lack of income, lack of resolution of disputes, a feeling of hopelessness, lack of human rights. All this put together leads people to behave the way they are. It is not country A's agenda. You mentioned Saudi Arabia. It is not country B's agenda. It is really much deeper. And unfortunately, no disrespect to the press, they always look at today's headline and they bring out these solutions as coming from a country. Today, we are in a real change taking place in terms of the degree of risk, in my view, last point, which is that non-state actors are conducting events around the world, and the system which we have to contain them is not really fully equipped. So when you have non-state actors doing that without anybody really controlling them, or it's not a government policy to do what is happening. I think no government in their right mind will do things as to what we see. There's no leadership. People feel frustrated. And lastly, I would say the big powers in the world, today they are further apart than they used to be. We need cohesion at that level. We need a commonality. You can disagree, but there must be areas you agree on. And let's show the world we can work together. So you know who the big powers are, I don't have to tell you, and they are changing. We must accept that and then move on and embrace each other to attack these problems. This whole situation of extremism, terrorism cannot be handled by one country alone. If we try to do that, we won't have success. More later.
I might come back to you on terrorism and deprivation. Tina, do you feel the world's a riskier place? And if it is, why aren't markets more worried?
Well, Shalka gave us some solutions. I'm just going to focus on the analysis. I think in geopolitical terms, this is probably the riskiest time in 25 years, this year being the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think that there are some very blunt ways that we can make that assessment. One is that between the annexation of Crimea and the ISIS rejection of the 1912 Sykes-Picot borders in Syria and Iraq, we have the potential for a return to disputes over borders and territory. And these are things that we haven't had to worry about really since World War II. So that is in its most basic form a major source of conflict throughout human history. On a secondary level, I think there are huge questions being asked now about the global system, particularly about collective security arrangements, so that if you are Estonia, Japan, Israel perhaps, you are really wondering at the moment if the collective security arrangements, the umbrella that you are part of, really still stands. And there was a very good economist leader on this that said, what is worth fighting for? We are living in a time where there is great concern here in this country. The aftermath of the Iraq War has led to great reluctance to consider the use of hard power, and that's also true in the US. Not that the use of hard power in itself necessarily brought about a lot of stability, but there are big questions about commitment to so-called red lines, deterrence, you name it. So that leads to a lot of questions. So in geopolitical terms, I think that we are looking at a paradigm shift. Markets haven't reacted to these developments. They've really localized them and treated them as idiosyncratic, one-off developments. I think that's a mistake, and I think on this panel we're very well equipped to discuss this. But markets have been able to do this because of unprecedented central bank action on the one hand. So markets have been able to effectively subcontract out geopolitical risk, and of course changes in supply dynamics in terms of shale, because the last, in the last 30 years, U.S. recessions have always been accompanied by an oil price spike. We've got oil prices going the opposite direction now, so we're in some sense somewhat uncharted territory.
Thank you. Sir Richard.
Well, I agree with what Tina's saying. I think there's a loss of confidence in collective security, generally speaking. And I mean, to pick up another point that's been made already, I think there's a decline in the willingness and the capability of the international community to act together to solve problems, whether they are macro sort of climate change level type issues or population growth type issues, or, at a more modest level but still serious regional crises. And there, I think, is a feeling of powerlessness in the international community. And I think another point worth making, which is sort of overarching, is, I mean, one of the impacts of technology, I think, is to diffuse power away from governments to smaller groups. And if you don't have, as it were, civic security or a secure state in which to enjoy the benefits of this technological diffusion of power, the effects of that, I think, can be highly disintegrative. And I think what we're seeing globally now is serious question marks about our ability as groups of nations to solve our most pressing problems.
Thank you. Well, we're going to come back to the specifics. We're going to start with one, which is the big headline of Ebola at the moment, and ask Professor Waldman, who's the expert, to talk about both Ebola and the other potential health risks that we face. Professor.
Thank you very much. I want to start by answering your question as to whether the world is a riskier place. Let me start by saying there's a risk to the audience that as a professor I might slip into lecture mode, and I don't want to do that. But otherwise, I do think the world is a riskier place. I think it's riskier because of the increasing encroachment of humans, of our species, on territory that was initially the domain of others. And let's face it, that's the origin of Ebola. Ebola is an animal disease that has now crossed over species barriers and entered our own. And the propagation of the disease now, as we read in the newspapers, is from human to human. But we shouldn't forget that these events are becoming more, these biological events are becoming more frequent because there are more people who are engaged in more activities that bring them into contact with other species that 10 or 20 or 100 years ago we would not have normally had contact with. I guess the archetypal disease of which this is the case is AIDS, one of the other pandemic scourges of our time. But let's stay with Ebola. It's the news of the moment, as you mentioned. I want to start, maybe take it in growing concentric circles and begin by saying a little bit about the situation as it exists locally in the three most affected countries of West Africa, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. The risks there are obviously enormous, and the risks locally have been realized. The consequences of those risks have been realized. I don't want to talk this morning about the epidemiology of the disease. We know that there are more than 10,000 cases, more than 5,000 deaths. We know that these are underestimates. We don't know the exact numbers. And I'd like to say that as a principal theme of my remarks is that, unfortunately, as is often the case in settings like this, we're dealing in what I call is a data-free zone. That in and of itself is a risk. We don't know exactly what's going on. There were reports from organizations with which I'm currently working that the epidemic in Liberia, for example, has stalled to a certain extent, that the numbers are not growing in the exponential fashion that has been predicted by others. But by the same token, we hear from other sources that indeed there are more cases occurring, and that last week the World Health Organization recorded the highest number of cases over the past 4 weeks. So we don't really know, and we have to get ground truth on this information. Locally, the disease has affected much, much more than the health sector alone. Agriculture has been seriously affected, and this leads to poor crops, insufficient food, food insecurity on the part of the population. Transportation has been affected. All government services have essentially come to a halt. The markets have been drastically affected, and GDP is estimated to fall. If the high numbers are indeed going to be attained, GDP will fall to by well over 5% in a country that has been making fairly remarkable growth over the course of the past decade since the end of its civil war. This will lead to an inability of people to pursue their livelihoods. This in turn will throw people below the poverty line in numbers as we haven't seen before in a very short period of time. So the disaster to these three countries has been accomplished and achieved, and we'll now have to spend probably decades trying to help them rebuild and regain just the gains that have been made in the past decade. There are risks also regionally, and I want to divide these into two, because we have countries such as Cote d'Ivoire, such as Senegal, who are right next door. For some reason, they've been spared so far. This isn't a particularly contagious disease. I'll come back to that. But so far, the disease has been confined. We know that Nigeria has had 20 cases, but they've been able to stop the epidemic from spreading. We know that Senegal has had 1 case. It hasn't contributed to spread within that country. And now we know that there is 1 case in Mali. We haven't heard yet about spread from a 2-year-old girl who died, having come from Guinea across the border. Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Senegal, these are wealthier countries than the 3 most affected countries. We've already seen prices of chocolate rise considerably, at least in the United States. I don't know if there's the same love of chocolate in the, of course there is in the UK. Probably a worldwide phenomenon. I read yesterday that chocolate prevents the loss of memory in old age, so we should all, as Halloween approaches, I think we should all consider
to old age to
we should all consider eating more candy. Anyway, the markets in those countries will be affected. Bauxite has been affected. Rubber production has been seriously affected. Palm oil production is down, and so on and so forth. The impact on the markets is great. Otherwise, in the rest of Africa, it's not much different from other continents. You know, there are parts of Africa that are further away from the epicenter of Ebola than Europe, for that matter. It was fairly remarkable to me to read last week that in the state of New Jersey, in the news for Ebola for a number of reasons, but last week 2 children from Rwanda were barred entry to school because of fears of Ebola. Rwanda is further away from New Jersey than Dallas, Texas, where there actually was Ebola. So it's hard to understand the reaction at times of people. It's difficult to understand, but on the same token, it is understandable because this is a disease that, while not particularly contagious, has a very, very high mortality rate in those who contract it, as you all know. The risk to outside of the area in Africa, as I'm saying, therefore, is considerably less than what it is in the neighboring countries. And on the global scene, I don't think in countries where there is a relatively strong public health system that the risk is appreciable at all. We have had importations into Spain, into France, into even UK, people who contracted Ebola in Africa and were brought here for treatment into Norway. We've had introductions now on 2 occasions into the United States, as well as people who fell ill in the United States, as well as people being brought to the United States with illness that they contracted in Africa. There's been fundamentally no spread. Let me illustrate the point by saying the case in Texas that many of you are aware of, a gentleman from Liberia who arrived, went to the hospital early in his illness, was turned away mistakenly, returned to the hospital, but not until after he had been living with his girlfriend, living in a small apartment with his family members for 4 days, came back to the hospital, ultimately died. The only people who were infected from that patient were 2 nurses who had quite close contact with the patient. None of the family members, the girlfriend, no one in the public who had that level of contact was infected, became ill at all. So the risk we know from the first outbreak of Ebola in 1976, and there have been 19 prior outbreaks of Ebola, which have all been contained relatively easily, although sometimes the measures are quite drastic that one has to take. But there's been very little spread, and what spread there has been principally in healthcare workers, to the point that in a report to the CDC in Atlanta in 1976, it was described as a health workers' disease, and that remains the case to this day. The risk on a global level is more one of perception than one of science, is the point that I'm trying to make. And if we allow ourselves to remain rational, if we allow ourselves to follow the science, then the kinds of large newspaper headlines that we've been seeing recently really should not be occurring, and they should not be of particular concern. The headline in the Washington Post this morning, for any of you who've been following the changes in policy that have been following politics rather than science, the changes were that Ebola policy has become a, quote, chaotic brawl, unquote. I don't think that it's chaotic brawling that we like to see in the world of public health as scientists and epidemiologists. What is the future of Ebola then? I would just say that I think that it will come under control. It would come under control more easily and perhaps even more rapidly if we had an effective vaccine, which should be available sometime early in the next year and should be rolled out to scale maybe by the spring to early summer, according to the World Health Organization. It would come this epidemic would come to a close perhaps more rapidly and with better results if we had effective medication for treatment, which we do not have. Although these things have been in the pipeline for years and up to a decade, it hasn't become a major area of investment until this event has occurred and fear has spread around the world. That seems to be the way we work as humans. So I think that we're going to be coming to the end of this. It's a blip. There will be other pandemics that occur from other viruses that will also be caused by the encroachment of the human population on areas where maybe we shouldn't be going without taking more protective measures. But I think that we need to approach this in a rational and panic-free manner.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to terrorism. And one possibility, of course, is weaponizing some of these viruses. But I was thinking, Sir Richard, back to the 1930s doctrine that the bomber will always get through. Yesterday, a jogger with a knife could have killed the Prime Minister. So will the terrorists always get through? How much of a problem is it when tactics change among terrorists, not necessarily crashing planes anymore, but shooting soldiers?
Well, we've definitely improved our capability to deal with, let's say, organized terrorism, I mean, terrorism of conspiracy, where, you know, there's a group making plans, and, I mean, to that extent, I think, you know, we have evened the equation, particularly when you're dealing with a movement like Al-Qaeda. I mean, what you saw yesterday with a jogger on the street running into the Prime Minister is an individual, you know, behaving in a spontaneous fashion. And I think similarly the recent terrorist event, tragic though it was in Ottawa in Canada, is an individual acting, you know, almost spontaneously. And it's very, very difficult for any society to cope with one individual who, for whatever motivation, you know, decides to do something dreadful. I mean, as regards the current level of terrorist threat, well, I've said some quite controversial things recently, and I'll repeat them. I mean, I think that, you know, there is a war of religion in the Middle East between Shia and Sunni. It's a Muslim-on-Muslim war. That will have reverberations in all our countries, in our Muslim communities in particular. And it does increase the risk of terrorist-related violence. But I think the threat that we face now, I'm personally of the view that it's rather different from the specific targeting of Western values and interests that Al-Qaeda was and continues to conduct with a diminished capability. The terrorist threat is not by any means removed. But I think it's also worth touching on, let's say, the issue that's peripherally raised by talking about diseases like Ebola. Because it's maybe a little irresponsible to say too much in public about this. But at the end of the Cold War, we know, for example, that the Soviet Union researched a lot of diseases and illnesses, Ebola, Marburg's disease amongst them, to look at them as potential biological weapons. Now, those researches stopped, and, you know, the programs were ended by agreement. And the biological and chemical weapons conventions in that respect were reasonably effective. But there's always been a fear that some of this knowledge through individuals might leach into terrorist groups. And there's no question that Al-Qaeda, when it had its sanctuaries in Afghanistan, researched in various places all sorts of things. But there are really significant problems to do with weaponization, which are not necessarily available to small groups, even if they're scientifically equipped. So, I mean, I think that this is something which is, as it were, latent as a threat rather than being actual. And I think that the way that one should look at it and interpret is that, you know, most terrorism is about delivering political messages through violence. It's not necessarily about lethality. It's about, as it were, deploying your arguments through fear. And of course, disease is quite an effective way to deploy an argument through fear, even if it's not very lethal. And for example, putting someone with a disease, a communicable disease like Ebola, into the international airline system would not necessarily be very lethal, but it would be highly disruptive. And therefore, the message would have been successfully deployed. So I think we need to be very careful in making distinctions when we talk about these issues, because if you sort of think lazily about them, you can really misinform people. And I mean, I'm being quite critical of governments generally for the messages they deliver about the terrorist threat, because they haven't been sufficiently analytical and sufficiently precise in talking about the reality of those threats. And I think here in the UK we slightly have wandered inadvertently into that area. And I mean, the government, because of the, as it were, blame machine that exists out there, are always overcompensating for being attacked if something goes wrong.
Just very quickly, do these codes, what are we at the moment, critical or something, do those help? I don't know what to do if it's critical, do I?
Well, I think they help in terms of, let's say, making people aware that, there are problems out there, and a lot of it is to do with the protection of utilities and infrastructure, and making sure that, our critical infrastructure isn't damaged by a lack of, let's say, surveillance over them.
Okay. Gina, how do you see terrorism as one of the great risks?
Well, the point I was going to make actually is that both in the case of Ebola and ISIS, these may be statistically less likely to be disruptive risks, but in both cases, you've had a policy response that has been quite strong, so that, whether it's Chris Christie in New Jersey and the fear factor in US policy, or in the case of ISIS, you had a 20-point shift in US public opinion after the first captive was beheaded. And that really moved the needle in terms of involvement, again, in the Middle East, in a way that last summer's alleged chemical weapons use by the Assad regime just didn't. And it really, those executions transformed what was happening in the Middle East from a distant regional dispute to a domestic terrorism issue, so that now you have President Obama as the 4th successive US president to authorize airstrikes in the Middle East. So public opinion is having a very important factor in how policymakers act, even if people like us are focused on the statistical risks.
General, I want to focus on the fighting terrorism. One of my favorite books as a kid was Eagle of the Ninth, where the Roman legion marches into Scotland, and in the mist they all get picked off and the legion disappears. You've got tanks, we're bombing ISIS at the moment, but it's not an army. As soon as the planes come, they can run away, they don't have a uniform. Have we got a problem that we have weapons to fight the Luftwaffe and the old Red Army, but our enemy, those aren't the right weapons for fighting the enemy?
Well, we're not going to be able to bomb ISIS and take it out of destruction. But, there's a great power struggle going, and just some of the themes the panel picked up on earlier. The borders are shifting. People sense that the order that emerged at the end of the Cold War is up for dispute. It's up for grabs. And so what you have is, today, you have Russian tanks moving in eastern Ukraine, and you have Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia juggling. Terrorism is a tool in this region. ISIS is a creation. It's Baathists, it's terrorists, it's religious zealotry. Before Mosul was taken down, states approved the takedown. The takedown of Mosul was a direct shot at Prime Minister Maliki. It was an effort by Sunnis to destroy the credibility of the Shia-dominated Iraqi government. And then it's possible ISIS might get out of control. But the formula for ISIS is very simple. You've got to restore governance in the region. Where is that governance going to come from? So it's not going to come from US boots on the ground, or even British boots on the ground, which are, as all of us know, much more subtle and effective than American boots on the ground. And because Britain's had so much more experience at this. But no, you can't do this with a Judeo-Christian army in this region. It's got to be the local people. But there are so many cross-cutting rivalries. So ISIS is going to be contained. And for the United States, the essential point is, let's not put U.S. troops back in on the ground and further bleed off resources and attention from the more significant problems. The most significant challenge the United States is facing right now is to maintain and strengthen its relationship with Europe, and to work with Europe to strengthen Europe itself. Because with Europe and the United States together, the two regions that most share each other's values, the rest of these problems can be manageable. If these two regions come apart, which is the threat that Vladimir Putin poses, the distraction of ISIS poses, then much more change and much more risk will follow that.
Thank you. Prime Minister Aziz, I want to come back to you on something you said right at the start about terrorism and deprivation, because if you think back to 9/11, a lot of the people involved in that were actually very educated people, engineers and so on. Is it all about deprivation, or is it?
Yeah, it depends how you define deprivation. Deprivation is not just lack of income or lack of education. It's a feeling of hopelessness which comes from a lack of reaction from the state or the world as to what people consider their genuine problems and needs are. And that's really what deprivation is. I said it very fast, but income is one aspect. Mm-hmm. It's much deeper than that. But may I just respond to one or two issues which were raised here in the panel. First on ISIS. It started as a sectarian war, a Shia-Sunni war. The issues we should raise as citizens of the world is how were they started, who encouraged them, who funded them, and why can't we... Now, everybody thinks they know the answers, but I would humbly submit it's not as simple as it seems. So there's work to be done here, and that's not happening, number one. Number two, in many conflicts, one has seen around the world, take Afghanistan, for example, post 9/11 and all what happened, troops went from everywhere, including this country and the United States, into... What I have seen is that the entry strategy into an area of conflict or potential conflict is thought out to a good degree and reasonable degree. But in almost all situations, I've found the exit strategy either missing, incomplete, or really not there. So suddenly, there's pressure domestically in the country which is sending the troops. Time is enough, let's go back. Our budget is hurting, blah, blah, blah. And we've had so many casualties, let's go. You leave a vacuum. And unfortunately for all of us as citizens of the world, when you leave such vacuums, you sow the seeds of a new conflict, which is much deeper and much more difficult to extricate from. Now, time doesn't allow us to go into detail. Iraq is similar. Afghanistan is similar. Then there's another factor, which hasn't yet been mentioned, which is related to the causes of terrorism. When we force regime change, and I'm not saying regime A is good and B is bad, let's not get into that. When you have regime change by external intervention, supposedly supporting the masses of the people, masses in the country, and then suddenly people disappear. So you have, good or bad, government leaders being killed by NATO troops. Now, in some countries, that person goes away, the country implodes. Nobody thinks about the post-intervention strategy. So we have created 10 times more problems than the country had before. With the result, these become havens of terrorism and extremism. And recruiting is so easy, because they said these jets came, they killed ABC, he or she is gone, now we will run it, and then there are tribes and groups, etc. So we really have to sit back and think, not to look at the symptoms alone, but the root causes. That's why I mentioned earlier. One other thing is the whole essence of terrorism it's a hearts and minds issue. It's not a fighting and killing each other issue. And the machinery we apply to solve a potential terrorist situation is more on the military type intervention or security type. Nobody stands up and says, now, this is a hearts and minds problem. How do I change the mindset here of this kid in school who's willing to blow himself up with explosives all over his body? How do we prevent that? Does it mean more secret service, more policing, more listening to telephone calls? No. Last point is the ISIS, on ISIS. Obviously, this is a new phenomenon because they are taking over territory. This is very rare. And fighting organized troops in a country, this creates new challenges, which we really haven't addressed as the world. And it may go beyond Shia-Sunni. You know, there are tribal lines, there are ethnic, sectarian. Sectarian would be Shia-Sunni, but it's much deeper than that. So what do we do? I think here we need the world to come together. Today, I'm sorry to say, the big powers are in more a blocking and tackling mode rather than let's sit. There are some problems for the world. We have differences, put them aside. Let's sit together and try to find solutions. Terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, does not respect borders. They do not respect borders at all. So we have to bring these countries together, at least the P5, and let's find collective solutions. But today, the mood in the P5 is the worst I've seen in a long time. There is no will to act together. There is no will to confront all the obvious issues. And so long as the issue is not in your territory, let it go.
Well, it's a good way to segue into geopolitics. So I'll come back to you, Sir Richard. So Neil Ferguson, the historian, compares this a bit like pre-1914. So you have China as the Wilhelmine Germany moving up, and Russia perhaps as the Austria-Hungary of the day, is of declining power, trying to bully its neighbours. Is there a specific problems? I mean, the period of US hyperpowerdom was actually quite short, but it's very unlikely, it would seem to me, that Prime Minister Aziz will get his wish and the powers will get together. How do you deal with these issues in a world where Russia and China are determined that nothing will be done because they don't approve of foreign intervention at all?
I don't have an answer to your question. How do you know, if I had the answer to that question, we would be able to pack the panel up and go home. And I really don't know. I mean, I find the way that the international behavior of both Russia in particular, but China as well, in its area of influence, has, let's say, deteriorated in terms of what we might have expected, you know, in the post-Cold War period. So you have, you know, Russia behaving very aggressively within what it considers its area of influence and disregarding territorial borders. And I mean, similarly, you have China expanding its territorial claims in the South China Sea in a very aggressive fashion, and you see, you know, the tension as a consequence in the response of Japan and the, you know, recreation of Japanese military capability to respond to that. I suppose my main expectation in terms of the medium to long term is that I think that Russia is politically unstable, despite Putin's popularity, and obviously it's economically in a rather difficult position, particularly with decline in energy prices. So, and the other thing about Russia is it has really appalling demographics. So, you know, Russia's self-confidence at the moment in the way it's behaving internationally has a very fragile base. But I think there's one other point that we should take note of. I think that it's a catastrophe for the Russian leadership that it should lose Ukraine, as it were, to Europe, which is effectively what's happening, at a time when Europe, politically and economically, is almost a basket case. And so, you know, there's a deep irony in this, because it shows that, you know, the actual political strength of the Russian leadership itself is to be questioned. So, I mean, I think that's one aspect. I mean, on China, my own personal view is that there is a significant anomaly between China's economic development and its political system. and that it's very difficult in the medium term to be confident about China's own political stability. So if you ask me what the solution to these problems are, I think that they may be as much internal to the countries that we see causing them as to, as it were, external forces playing a role which maybe pulls them back into the international community. But this is a very complex and difficult area.
And can I just follow up on something else Prime Minister Aziz said, which was about Western intervention?
Yeah.
So we put boots on the ground in Iraq, and that was a disaster. We bombed Libya rather than put boots on the ground, and that's probably a disaster. We did nothing in Syria initially, and that also has been a disaster. So what would your advice be to a current Prime Minister if he says, should we intervene, if we intervene in the Middle East, is this more likely to cause terrorism or less likely to cause terrorism?
Well, obviously, if we intervene, then, there are reverberations. I think my view, having been openly a supporter of our intervention in Iraq, is probably now that we make efforts with our allies in the Middle East. There are still a number of countries with whom we can work very constructively to contain these problems so that their regional impact is limited, and at the same time, to try to squeeze the life out of them. But in fact, I think Prime Minister Shokat mentioned this himself. I mean, it's for the local powers to try to solve the problems internally with our support. And as Wes Clark said, I mean, bombing isn't going to solve the problem in Syria or in Iraq. It may help to contain it, and it may give local powers more opportunity to come up with a solution.
Tina?
Well, I think I might be a tiny bit contrarian now. First of all, in terms of what's the way to characterize the times that we're living in, I think both Russia and China are projecting power as regional hegemons. That's what their objective is. And of course, the last 150 years of US foreign policy has been about preventing the rise of regional hegemons. But if we also, as President Obama says, we're not going to be the world's cop anymore, it provides space and opportunity for this. And the territorial disputes that have been discussed, whether it's the Senkakus or Crimea, are part of this objective. The word aggressive was used. I prefer the word assertive. But in both cases, both Russia and China are trying to exert more influence within their region. I feel very cautious about a declinist narrative about Russia. I mean, the demographics are true. In a country that crosses 8 time zones, you have people concentrated in a few cities. But Russia is really not on the verge of being a failed state. And I think that the West would make a big mistake if it were to calibrate its policy approach on that basis. Oil prices are softening. That hurts Russia. 4 rounds of sanctions are hurting Russia economically. In the short term, a weaker ruble, of course, actually can help. But President Putin, as everyone knows, is highly popular. And if anything, it may be that this sense of opposition and isolation from the international community, at least in the medium term, boosts him, as does this whole narrative of self-reliance, which really appeals back to Soviet history, and it's a very powerful one. So I think that we ought to be careful about being dismissive of Russia. Also, of course, they have huge FX reserves that can last a long time like this. There's another point here as we concentrate on the world's woes, and that may be what isn't going wrong. One of the really important things in the global system that isn't going wrong is the US-China relationship, which is not perfect, but it's not really suffering from the current geopolitical tensions in a significant way. There is still communication. The Russia relationship with the West is more troubled. I understand that even art exchanges aren't happening now. Things that happened during the Cold War aren't happening, so that breakdown is important. One thing we haven't mentioned also, where all of this comes together, is a deadline happening this month and that is on Iran's nuclear program. And the P5, as Shaukat has been talking about, cooperate on that front. Also, Russian participation is very important in resolving Iran's nuclear program. So what happens if we don't get an extension on that deal? Are we going to return to the rhetoric of attacking Iran's nuclear facilities? How are we going to do that in an environment where nobody wants to use hard power? It all becomes much more complicated, and we don't actually have a lot more time to work on this issue.
General, I'll come back to you saying, interventionism, you were involved in one of the more successful interventions. President Obama wanted to scale back interventionism and has been forced back in. Do you think the West is stuck, that it'll be forced to repeatedly intervene in these conflicts? Or do you think the US can really, maybe we'll have a different president in 2 years' time, well, obviously we will, but a different party in power, that would be an isolationist and pull back completely from...
I don't think we're going to be an isolationist. I think we're going to work with people in the region to try to resolve these problems. The question is, can we get our priorities right? I think there are some major long-term problems. They are terrorism, cybersecurity, financial system stability, the ascent of China and managing that successfully, and climate change that nations need to come together to work on. They have to be worked on collectively. For the United States to lead this, the problem is that we're doing somewhat better than Europe economically, but we have a viciously partisan political system. It's getting worse, not better, as increasing amounts of money flow into the political cycle. And the question is, can we come together within the United States to provide the constructive long-term policies that are necessary rather than lurching out to each crisis with some quick response? As Tina said, a 20% jump in people favoring intervention because a man's beheaded. I mean, honestly, it was a sucker play. There's nothing ISIS wants more than U.S. troops on the ground so they can represent themselves as fighting against the infidels and bring in more money and more recruits. So wisely, we've tried to resist that, but I think, in this panel, one of the things, if I could suggest for just a second, put yourself outside this realm and think about how Putin must see the world. Tina was mentioning Putin and Russia. So look at it this way. He has an unstable economic base. As Richard said, maybe the country is not going to last in the long term, but he does have power right now. The sanctions actually help him because these Western-oriented companies that are being hurt come to him for help. He sees a triple play emerging. He can involve through the P5 in the Iran nuclear negotiations, and he can say to the United States, if you don't work with me, I'm not going to help you with Iran, and you'll have a huge problem. But I want Ukraine. Now, I've showed I'm willing to do whatever's necessary to get it. You're going to put sanctions on me, but I'll be nice enough. I don't like the sanctions. They're not going to hurt me that much, but I'd rather not have them. So, but I could also help you or hurt you in Syria. You see, I have this magnificent air defense system. If I put it into Syria, there is no more military option for you to go in and use your air power against Bashar al-Assad. And I'd like to have Bashar al-Assad in power because he can work against terrorists and Chechens, but also he likes me. So Putin can see this. He can maneuver this thing, or he's trying to get a triple play. He can see himself going to the G20 summit in Australia. He can see himself organizing the follow-on effort in Ukraine, but not necessarily. He can play it politically or economically. He can see using American bombing to strengthen Assad's regime in Syria. And at the end of this, he could come out with Ukraine, his presence in Syria, leverage over the United States still on a never-to-be-completed Iranian nuclear negotiation, and the end of sanctions. It's not a bad set of intermediate-range gambits, and from Putin's position, it's all possible. And so I think when you look at geostrategic risk, as we're doing here, you have to not only look at how it looks from our perspective, but look at him. He, in particular, is a major factor of unpredictability in this environment. China's more predictable, Iran, Turkey, the United States, but Putin is the wild card in this, and he's connected to major theaters of uncertainty.
Prime Minister, just briefly, because I want to get on to energy before we finish.
I cannot help but say one or two things reacting to what I just heard. And I agree with the general. I think what I referred to earlier is the P5 have to stop blocking and tackling and talking to each other. This is so crucial. And here I think we talked about China's ascendancy and all that. I have had the privilege of dealing with all the P5, mostly United States and China, because these were the two closer countries to Pakistan. Never did we find either country trying to go cross the line in tackling their issues with us. So I think this notion which we read about and perceptions which hang around, that maybe they come and say this is the way, take it or leave it, it doesn't work that way. Never before have I seen a situation where the five of them, and particularly the three, Russia, China, US, need to put their heads together and really come out on issues which don't, it's not always competition. Even what you see in the South China Sea, this is not the forum to discuss it today, there's much more agreement than disagreement. But if you read the papers, you feel that maybe tomorrow there'll be a big issue. So the key message we have to leave with everybody, at least I would like to, is that whatever influence we have, use it on the P5 to come together. Last point, ISIS. I just leave one question for everybody to reflect on. How come so many people were recruited from the West, where we have sophisticated intelligence, monitoring of internet, all that goes on. How come so many were recruited, sent somewhere outside, trained, came back, recruited more, trained them too, and they are in a situation of conflict outside? Number one. Number two, when some of these people come back, what are we doing to make sure they are assimilated into society as normal citizens? Or will this thing spread in the countries they have gone to? And this is not just the Middle East or developing world, it is everywhere, and the whole audience knows that because they read the press.
Thank you. I want to come back to the last risk and maybe energy, if perhaps somebody did worry about energy and natural resources competition. I want the professor to come back as well. So, Sir Richard, the one risk you'd worry about most at the moment, if the audience were to worry about one thing out of all the things we've discussed, what would you?
Well, top of my list at the moment is the situation in Europe and the instability caused by Russia. And I would add to that, because no one's mentioned it, but I won't expand on it. I'm worried about the rise of populist political movements across European countries, including the UK.
Good, thank you. Tina?
Same question.
Same question. The one risk you worry about, but if it happened to be energy, I'd be very grateful.
Well, I'm gonna do two also.
Yeah.
I think tensions leading to conflict between Russia and NATO is the biggest risk that we face. I think that tensions, without going to full-blown conflict, of course, are already causing a growth hit to Europe, right? So sanctions are not only hitting the Russian economy, they are hitting the Eurozone recovery, and there is a real risk of a triple-dip recession in Europe, and these tensions make that worse. So I think that is being underpriced at the moment. In terms of populist parties, I've written a lot about what I call vox populi risk, which is the risk of more volatile public opinion. And I think the point that I would make here is that growth, the link between growth and political stability has been broken, right? The fact that in this country we continue to have a robust economic recovery has not prevented UKIP from getting 25% of the vote in the European parliamentary elections this year and heading to do very well in next year's general election. So it's a mistake, as many of my colleagues in the economics group would say, to assume that a return to growth will paper over this disconnect between the establishment and the public. That seems to be, if anything, getting worse.
No real wage growth, of course, have we? So, General, you mentioned Putin's master strategy, cutting off the gas to Europe this winter. Do you think that's part of it? And do you worry about?
I think it's a card that could be played. But here's what I worry most about. I worry about why Europe, with trillions of dollars, wonderful technology, great people, can't restart its economy. I don't understand it. Take Germany, for example. After you rule out the use of nuclear energy in Germany, and you're loaded with coal, and you've said no fracking, fine. take that coal and convert it to liquid fuel or natural gas. The technology's there, the capital's there. All it takes is leadership. It's the perfect leadership position for Germany to take to restart its own economy and the Eurozone economy. And if Germany would do that, we'd move away from dependence on Middle Eastern oil. Now, this has been an unholy bargain set by the United States and Saudi Arabia for 80 years to protect Saudi in terms of our buying their oil, and then we're protecting them, and they're feeding extremist Sharia. And it's time to stop it. Germany could stop it.
Does it make a difference the US will be energy independent for these geopolitical?
We'd love it if the United States would be energy independent, but when the price of oil goes down to $80, you have to read in that there might be some Saudi concern.
Right.
Were we not to become dependent on Saudi Arabia.
Prime Minister?
About
Your biggest risk, your biggest worry at the moment?
my biggest risk is lack of leadership in the world, especially in the larger countries.
What if but you wanted us all to get together, so let's agree to everything Mr. Putin wants. Would that be
No.
a viable
Agreeing
solution?
to everything which anybody wants is not diplomacy
But
and not leadership.
if he won't compromise, how do we get that collectively?
You know, you just mentioned something which provoked me a little, which is
Good.
what if Putin turns off the gas? He
Yes.
needs the money too. By the way, this
What is
gas
it?
is not sold free. The money has to go back. He has
He's
to
got
pay
all
his
these
bills.
reserves.
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway.
Reserves can also be impaired very
Yes.
easily. We know that.
Professor, health risks. So you mentioned the possibility for other pandemics apart from Ebola. We've also been hearing the difficulty of getting the great powers to collaborate. Is that one of the big risks for future? Not that Ebola is the problem, but H1N1 or some other?
Well, it is a risk. As the Prime Minister said, viruses like terrorism do not respect borders. So they are a global issue in the public health domain. Unlike Sir Richard, I do have the answers to Ebola. It's not really too complicated. You detect patients as early as possible in the course of their illness. You isolate them. You treat patients humanely and with dignity. We've done this before with prior epidemics. Smallpox was a real scourge in the world. It does not exist anymore. It's been eradicated. Guinea worm disease, almost eradicated. Poliomyelitis, with the exception of Pakistan and a little bit in northern Nigeria, almost totally eradicated. We can do this in the public health world, but there is a serious risk, and the risk is that we are not prepared enough to respond as quickly as possible. Fighting viruses is not a war of ideology. It's not a war for political power, but we need to be, we get in our own way because we see the risk coming over the horizon. But we know it's there. We know because of our actions and our interactions with other species that we're going to be, and we're going to remain susceptible to these biological threats. But we are not adequately prepared, and when these events occur, we don't respond quickly enough. This particular Ebola outbreak is out of control because we did not respond for 8 months after it began to the warnings that were issued by those on the site. We sat there and we watched it and we watched it and we watched, and then we said, uh-oh, we're in trouble now. So the risk is the lack of preparation. There is a new multinational initiative called the Global Health Security Agenda that was launched by President Obama, but that has substantial buy-in from countries around the world. We hosted a meeting at our university recently of this initiative, and from the public health world, it calls attention to the fact that there can be natural occurrences of disease that can turn into pandemics, such as the Ebola outbreak now. There can be accidental releases from laboratories where research is occurring of viruses that can take a substantial toll. And it must be said, there can be intentional use of biological agents as well. To this last one, we have less of an answer. That was the topic of discussion for most of the panelists today. For the others, we do have answers, but we have to make enough investment to be able to be adequately prepared, and then we have to respond in a timely fashion to threats that we're facing.
Good. Well, the red light is flashing, so the panel's come to an end, and I just want to ask you to thank very much the panelists for their views and expertise. Thank you very much.